Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most intense, heavily debated topics in modern politics. Why exactly are modern leaders so frequently compared to historical dictators? We're going to completely strip away the political noise today and look strictly at the historical data and moral frameworks to figure out what these comparisons actually mean.
It's a highly provocative phrase, and let's be honest, you hear it literally everywhere in the media right now. But are these comparisons actually accurate? Or do they kind of just distort our understanding of history? Well, to figure that out, we really need to zoom out from the heat of modern politics and look at the cold, hard frameworks of moral philosophy and historical consensus.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll look at the Trump and Putin historical analogies, define how ethicists actually view evil, evaluate the universal claim of national security, and finally explore how bitter enemies can actually become friends.
All right, let's start with Section 1, the Trump-Hitler analogy.
When experts really dig into this comparison, they usually break it down into 5 specific dimensions. If you look at rhetoric and spectacle, analysts definitely point out overlaps in nationalist demagogic language, things like scapegoating outgroups, and for sure the heavy reliance on mass rallies. But the comparison really fractures when it comes to institutional behavior, violence, and historical impact. While Trump attempted to reshape institutions, he was ultimately limited by the U.S. constitutional system. And crucially, there is absolutely no equivalent to the state-organized mass murder and global war orchestrated by Nazi Germany.
So the big takeaway here is that while critics point out overlapping tactics, like using specific words such as vermin or phrases about poisoning the blood, historians strongly warn against making a one-to-one equivalence. I mean, the comparison just completely breaks down when we look at historical outcomes. Trump hasn't targeted a single group for extermination, he hasn't built a totalitarian state, and he definitely hasn't launched a world war. Because of this, scholars often conclude that these analogies are used way more as warnings about authoritarian tendencies, rather than claims of literal equivalence.
Moving right along, Section 2, the Putin-Hitler analogy.
Interestingly, mainstream scholarship rejects a direct equivalence here too. Yes, there are clear authoritarian tactics at play, revisionist territorial claims on places like Ukraine, total state control over the media, and the severe suppression of political opposition. However, historians point out that Putin's aims are regional, not a doctrine of global conquest, and they lack an industrialized racial genocidal extermination project. Equating the two, historians warn, really distorts the unique, horrifying historical reality of the Holocaust.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit for Section 3, defining evil in geopolitics.
1.5 million. That is the staggering estimate of total casualties in Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. It is an absolutely massive moral weight. And when people hear a number like that, it naturally drives them to ask profound questions. Like, is a leader responsible for this inherently evil? How do we even intellectually and morally process this scale of destruction?
Now, to keep things totally factual, we have to look at what makes up that catastrophic moral cost. That 1.5 million figure actually includes Russian soldiers and allied forces, Ukrainian soldiers, and civilians on both sides. This incredibly high toll is exactly why human rights organizations like Amnesty International and the UN meticulously document specific violations like unlawful detentions and indiscriminate attacks, rather than broadly applying a subjective word like evil. They focus on evaluating the actions, not assigning a blanket label to an entire nation.
To really grasp how ethicists process all this, we need to look through 3 totally distinct moral lenses. First, there's the consequentialist lens, where leaders are judged by outcomes. So causing massive, preventable human suffering is seen as morally catastrophic. Then you have the deontological lens, where the focus is entirely on rules and principles. Under this view, invading a sovereign nation or suppressing free speech is just morally wrong, period, regardless of the justification. And finally, the realist lens. This one ignores morality entirely, viewing actions purely as strategy, risk, and power politics. So your answer to whether a leader is evil actually depends entirely on which of these 3 frameworks you're using.
That brings us to Section 4, security and moral asymmetry.
We are defending our people. Every single major power throughout history, East, West, it doesn't matter, has justified violence, invasions, and covert operations with some variation of that exact claim. But as moral philosophers are super quick to point out, simply having a justification for violence does not automatically make the resulting action moral.
So how do ethicists sort this out? Well, they separate motives from methods using 4 specific criteria. First up, proportionality. Does the violence actually match the threat? Second, necessity. Were there nonviolent alternatives? Third, intent. Is the goal truly defense, or is it just a convenient cover for expansion? And finally, harm to innocents. What is the actual impact on civilians? These criteria are exactly why moral responsibility is rarely perfectly symmetrical, even when both sides claim to be the defender. No major power has completely clean hands historically, for sure, but that doesn't mean every nation is equally responsible or equally immoral in any given conflict.
And finally, Section 5, How Enemies Become Friends. It sounds wild, but history actually proves that hostile nations, like France and Germany right after World War II, can become close allies. But there's a catch. It requires 4 very strict conditions. First, fear has to decrease. Friendship is literally impossible if you view the other side as an existential threat. Then, cooperation must become profitable, usually through trade or shared security. Next, you usually need big political shifts, like new leadership or changing public opinion. But the deepest layer, that's humanization. The relentless cycle of propaganda and dehumanization has to break. Reconciliation doesn't happen because nations suddenly fall in love. It happens because these underlying structural and psychological conditions shift.
So, is there actually any hope for us to stop destroying one another? Well, the historical data suggests yes, but with a massive caveat. Reconciliation doesn't require sudden magical trust. It simply requires the recognition that cooperation is far better than destruction. And that is a reality that only emerges when fear stops being used as our primary political currency. Think about that the next time you hear a historical comparison dominating the news cycle. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.